Hey guys, tonight we're stepping deep into the heart of the Spanish royal palace, where perfume couldn't save the day. And the moment the princess appeared, entire corridors instantly emptied. Not because everyone respected her, but because her scent could knock out a general. Imagine it, the summer of 1680. The suffocating heat clinging to every velvet curtain. The air in the palace thick with the scent of roses, leona, scented water, and something no one dared to name. Not the rotting fish from the market, but a smell seeping straight from inside the royal walls. While the maids hurried to spray perfumes, rub ointments, and scatter herbs, the courtiers accidentally turned their faces away. As a single name rang out like a warning, Princess Margarita Teresa. She was young, noble, and rotting, not in the literal sense, but the blood in her veins was the crystallization of centuries of inbreeding that the Habsburg dynasty had pursued as a matter of national policy. If you've ever sprayed air freshener after a small accident and thought that was bad, trust me, you wouldn't survive an afternoon in that palace. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. By the way, where are you listening from? Leave a comment and tell me your location and what time it is. Let's see how many time zones tonight's story reaches. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. And so, you are standing in a cool stone corridor of the Alcazar Palace, where the sound of clogs echoes amid the scent of lavender, mixed with something that makes your nose wrinkle involuntarily. Not everyone can detect it immediately. But when Princess Margarita Teresa walks by, you realize that the remarkable thing here is not the silk dress or the glittering diamond crown. It is the way everyone, from nobles to guards, takes half a step back, pretending to admire the paintings on the wall or adjust an unnecessary sleeve, just to avoid the waft of air coming from, you know where. People whisper that the smell is like 3-day-old dead fish soaked in rosewater, mixed with a handkerchief forgotten in a summer bathroom. Sadly, it did not come from clothing or perfume, but from the princess's own body. You might wonder, how could a princess of only 19, of royal blood, bathed in rosewater and wiped with Italian damask towels, carry a scent like a sin left unconfessed? That was the biological legacy of the Habsburgs, the most powerful dynasty in Europe at the time, but also the victim of a closed marriage policy so strict that imagine marrying your paternal cousin to your maternal cousin, and then repeating that cycle for 200 years. Throughout the dynasty, the Habsburg family often married within the family to preserve wealth, territory, and the purity of the royal bloodline. It sounded like, we keep the valuables in the house. But the problem was, when the entire gene pool became too familiar, the children would bear a faulty composition, where bad genetic segments were not diluted but multiplied. Margarita Teresa was a prime example of this. She was the daughter of King Philip IV and Queen Mariana, who was in fact his own niece. Yes, you heard that right. Her mother was the granddaughter of her own husband. Joke number 1. In those days, they didn't just keep gold in safes. They also kept relatives in marriage contracts. And the consequence, not just a frail physique and pale skin, but also a rare condition that caused her body to emit a distinctive odor, what physicians called endogenous bromhidrosis, though they dared not record it fully for fear of being accused of defaming the royal family. In a corner of the palace, the court painter Diego Velázquez once watched her silhouette, deep in thought. He had painted her since childhood. She was the little princess in the famous Las Meninas. But now, the girl who once stood proudly in the light of his art had become a young woman passing quietly by, carrying with her a genetic warning. Historians still debate the actual extent of Margarita's medical condition. Some believe she suffered from a metabolic disorder that prevented her body from breaking down sulfur compounds. Others suspect that the smell was merely exaggerated by French diplomats, who wanted to disgrace the Spanish royal family to make negotiations easier. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear: Margarita had to live with the glances, the whispers, and the invisible distance others gave her, even though no one dared say it aloud. Joke number 2. In that court, face masks should have been issued long before the COVID-19 era. Records tell that a cook named Maria once tried to create a special ointment for the princess. Mixing rosemary, mugwort, and crushed orange peel, she whispered to her apprentice, "Poor girl, she didn't get to choose her bloodline." Meanwhile, across the Great Hall, royal advisors were discussing where the princess might be married off to. The problem was, the royal houses of Europe had begun to smell the signs of the Habsburg decline, both figuratively and literally. A little noticed historical event is that in the year 1673, Margarita was married to the Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, who was her first cousin once removed. Yes, once again, the bloodline spiraled like a twisted staircase. And although this marriage was considered a political success, her health continued to decline after leaving Spain. In the year 1679, the princess died at the age of 21. And the strange thing was, at her funeral, perfume was burned around the coffin 3 times more than usual. A small detail, but one no one dared to comment on publicly. Joke number 3. If you think you're having a bad day, remember, there was once a princess who had to use licorice oil just so people would come near her. Are you breathing more slowly now? Is the breeze from the fan by your ear beginning to soothe the noise in your mind? Because this story is only just beginning, and there is another person, another main character in this tragedy, sitting beyond the gates of the Alcazar, Carlos II, the princess's younger brother, the one who would inherit the crown, carrying not only the royal regalia, but also the fragile destiny of a dying empire. They often say the throne is a burden, but for Carlos II, Margarita Teresa's younger brother, that was not just a metaphor. That throne, gilded and inlaid with gems, set in the great hall of the royal palace, was heavy not with its material, but with the faulty genes the boy had been born, unable to refuse. Imagine a 12-year-old boy, called His Majesty, but unable to stand for more than 5 minutes. Slow to learn letters, unable to speak clearly because his tongue was too large for his malformed mouth. Every time he tried to pronounce his own name, it was like a small wrestling match between his will and his body. The physicians of the time recorded that Carlos suffered from congenital dwarfism, chronic malnutrition, and showed signs of neurological ataxia. You, looking through the lens of modern science, might guess that the boy had conditions like Klinefelter syndrome, androgen insensitivity, or even a rare variant that left his genetic code like an error-filled script that could not be compiled. But in those days, there was no DNA testing. They had only the cross, decoctions brewed from snake's blood, and the whispered prayers of nuns in the chapel. Joke number 1. If there had been an award for genes overcomplicated by politics, the Habsburgs would surely have won, and awarded it to themselves. During lessons with his tutor, Carlos often sat silently, staring out the window. From the upper floor classroom, he could see noble children playing tag in the gardens, running, laughing, falling, then standing up again. He had never joined them. Not because he wasn't allowed, but because a single light fall could leave him unable to get back up. Court records show that Carlos suffered seizures in fits, legs bowed from rickets, and digestion so weak he had to eat thin porridge from a specially made silver bowl. Though a king, each step required 2 people to support him. A monarch who could not walk alone. And here is the part that is harder to say. The court knew this well. King Philip IV. In the final years of his life, had been warned many times by physicians that his son might never be able to father children. But instead of stopping to reconsider, the royal council did the only thing they knew how to do: find another princess, to keep the bloodline going. Joke number 2, in the Habsburg court. Whenever there was a problem, they simply married another relative. When Carlos turned 18, a grand political marriage to Maria Luisa of Orleans was held. The bride, just 17, was the niece of Louis XIV, the proud son king of France. She arrived in Madrid after weeks on horseback, crossing mountains and borders, bringing with her new hope for the Spanish throne. And then she burst into tears the moment she saw her future husband. Not from emotion, but because before her stood a gaunt young man, with a jaw so misshapen he could not close his mouth, needing support just to remain standing. The wedding went on regardless. The priest's voice trembled as he recited the vows. When it came time for Carlos to speak, the entire church fell silent. He stammered out each syllable, every word like a pebble, swallowed the wrong way. Historians still debate whether this marriage was ever truly consummated. Some records suggest Carlos never fulfilled his duties as a husband because his body would not allow it. Others note attempts, supervised, aided by stimulants, and even prayers, but the result was still zero. Joke number 3. All of Europe at the time was in a panic, not over war, but over a royal couple who hadn't finished the job. At the wedding banquet, it said, Carlos only touched the cream soup and a few bites of mashed pear. His jaw hurt too much to chew meat, while foreign envoys toasted noisily. The young king simply watched. The Duke of Medina, a close royal advisor, whispered to a fellow courtier, "They're looking at him like vultures eyeing a weak prey." And he wasn't wrong, because throughout that wedding feast, Europe had already begun assessing the likelihood of the Habsburg line's extinction. Who would succeed if Carlos had no children? France, Austria, Portugal. A war of succession had quietly begun before the wedding cake was even cut, and in the long nights at the El Escorial Palace, murmured prayers could be heard, not for victory, or for good harvests, but for the king's fertility. Do you see sometimes the fate of an empire rests on something so fragile that no one dares to name it? Picture a November morning. Madrid's sky grey. The smell of dew clinging to old tiles, and the damp breath of marble seeping through the soles of your shoes. In the gardens of the royal palace of El Buen Retiro, a man sits alone on a stone bench, without a scepter in hand, without strength in his legs, yet with the crown of an entire fracturing empire upon his head. Carlos II. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. And truly, if you were a courtier at the time, you might have believed it, because no other explanation seemed enough to account for the sheer number of unusual things surrounding this king. The king could not speak clearly, could not eat properly, could not ride a horse, and he could not produce an heir. After nearly 10 years of marriage to Maria Luisa of Orleans, his first wife, the queen died suddenly at the age of 26. The official cause recorded was a burst appendix, but in the shadowed corridors of the palace, they whispered that she had simply exhausted herself from hope and from despair. Less than a year later, Carlos married again. This time, it was Princess Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German, from a family whose mother had borne 23 children. Yes, 23. The entire royal council hoped that this time the Habsburg genetics would be overpowered by imported vitality. Joke number 1. It was the first time anyone considered marrying a woman from a large family as a national defense strategy. But alas, the miracle never came. Maria Anna, though strong, resilient, and recognized as a politically astute woman, could not change the impossible. Years passed, and not a single child was born from that marriage. The Habsburg dynasty began counting each tick of the clock, as though counting the last drops of blood in veins already too thin. Historians still debate the specific cause of Carlos's infertility. Some post-mortem analyses lean toward the possibility that he suffered from Klinefelter syndrome, with an XXY chromosome pattern that caused feminized physical traits, hormonal imbalance, and the inability to produce sperm. Others suggest androgen insensitivity, a body unresponsive to male hormones. Whatever it was, the consequence was clear: an empire without a legitimate heir. In the small office behind the chapel, the king's personal physician, Juan Bautista Juanini, once carefully documented the final measures. They tried everything from secret herbal decoctions, ground gemstones, raw young goat testicles, to bizarre rituals such as bathing the lower body in the blood of freshly slaughtered animals. Nothing worked. Joke number 2. If you've ever tried every trick on the internet and your hair still falls out, remember the king bathed in goat's blood and still had no children. And so, time slipped by in silence. In the portraits of Carlos II in his final years, you can see the truth that could no longer be hidden: dull eyes, an abnormally protruding lower jaw, a shrunken frame, trembling hands. He spent most of his time in bed, prone to illness, easily collapsing. A cold could last 3 weeks. Every meal was a struggle. Every day he woke up was a small miracle. In his final days, Carlos still tried to do the one thing he could: leave a will. This was the pivotal historical event, because that will sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the longest and most complex conflicts in Europe at the dawn of the 18th century. In his final document, Carlos not only declared he had no children, but also named his successor Philippe, Duke of Anjou, the grandson of King Louis XIV of France. And just as you might expect, only hours after that name echoed through the great hall of the Alcazar, all of Europe erupted. Joke number 3. Not every war starts with gunfire. Some begin with a will written by a trembling hand. And so, the great powers of Europe entered a game of thrones. Austria, England, the Netherlands, France. Each put forward a candidate. Each drew up alliances. Each ready to step over Carlos's grave to claim the remains of the empire. But for Carlos himself, lying still in the royal chapel, face pallid, body contorted, it was all over. When the doctors performed the autopsy, they were stunned by what they found: a body almost devoid of blood, a heart shriveled to the size of a peppercorn, necrotic intestines, rotting lungs, and only a single blackened, shrunken testicle. The physicians of the time did not understand, but you do. It was not a curse, not witchcraft. It was science. The inevitable result of a chain of political decisions that had ignored the laws of biology for centuries. Carlos II did not die in war. He did not die by assassination. He died from within his own bloodline. Picture a cold afternoon at the end of November. In the solemn monastery of El Escorial, the burial place of generations of Spanish kings, the damp grey stone steps, the domes shrouded in mist, and a coffin being lowered into the crypt. No drums, no trumpets, no cheers, only the long toll of a bell and the flicker of candlelight blurring against carved vaults. Inside that coffin lay Carlos II, the last Habsburg king of Spain. No heir, no blood descendant, not a single child to carry his line to the throne. Joke number 1, and also a farewell. The Habsburg bloodline had been preserved so well that it could no longer be passed on to anyone. The death of Carlos was not only the end of a man, but the death knell of an entire dynasty. A dynasty once mighty across Europe, holding territories from the Netherlands to South America, once feared on both sea and land, now collapsing not because of rebellion or war, but because of a shrunken testicle Modern historians agree that the fall of the Habsburgs is a textbook example of politics against nature. They placed power above biology, placed the glory of bloodline above the laws of genetics, and paid the price with a slow, drawn-out degeneration over centuries, until there was no one left, able to rise to inherit. The remains of Carlos II now lie beneath cold marble, in the eternal darkness of the Escorial monastery, alongside dozens of other kings. But perhaps he is the only one to leave. No surviving blood at all. Have you ever visited the Prado Museum in Madrid? In a quiet room hangs a portrait of Carlos II, painted when he was a child. A boy with a long face, a jutting jaw, eyes that seem to want to say something, but do not know where to begin. You stand before that painting, hearing the soft echo of others' footsteps on polished stone, and suddenly feel your heart sink, because you know this is not a portrait of a powerful king. It is the portrait of a child used by history as a pawn. Joke number 2. If Carlos had lived in the 21st century, he might have been sent to a geneticist, attended special classes, and lived a quiet life in the suburbs of Madrid, instead of bearing an entire empire on his shoulders before he could even read. And do you know what is most tragic? That during Carlos's entire reign, those around him still believed in divine will. They claimed his weakness was due to a curse, that his strange voice was because he was possessed by evil spirits. Some even proposed exorcism through rebaptism. They did not know, or did not want to know, that this was not the devil, but genetics. Today, modern medical researchers confirm that Carlos II suffered from multiple genetic disorders linked to inbreeding. Faulty genes had been copied and multiplied with each generation, because the court was determined not to let royal blood be diluted. Historians still debate the so-called purity of royal blood, whether it was the most dangerous ignorance in European political history. Some say they did not know the consequences. Others say they knew, but feared losing power more than they feared deformity. Some European states later learned the lesson: avoid marrying royal offspring to close relatives. Strengthen marital alliances with other nations. But sadly, Carlos had already become the unavoidable symbol of that lesson. Joke number 3. When an entire court has to pray for one healthy testicle, you know politics has gone too far. And if you are still awake at this point, congratulations. You have just survived nearly 300 years of faulty genetic history, terrifying royal ceremonies, and a string of bad decisions signed in royal blood. Are you wondering, how could Carlos II carry so many defects at once? One man, just one, cannot be born with every symptom of genetic disorder unless something was wrong many generations before. And just as you suspect, Carlos was not an isolated error. He was the final product, the bugged build, after a long series of marriages calculated by politics, not the heart. This is when we must turn back time a little, leave behind the bleak 17th century, and return to the early days when the Habsburg Empire rose like a giant of Europe. They often repeated the family motto, "Let others wage war. You, lucky Austria, marry." It sounds poetic, wise, and strategic. But listen closely. Whom did they marry? They married each other. Circular marriage. An empire folded into itself. They married cousins, nieces, aunts, and sometimes even married a niece who called them uncle. In the royal world, the word family did not mean relatives are off limits. It meant preserve the territory. Imagine a family tree shaped like a circle, starting with the first couple, then the next generation marrying each other, until the circle closed. With each generation, that circle twisted tighter, and gradually, instead of a family tree with branching diversity, they created a genetic maze with no exit. Historians still debate who first opened the door to the Habsburgs' inbreeding policy. Some point to Maximilian I, the one who began building the empire through marriage, But most agree that from Philip the First, father of Charles V onward, every marriage was as closed as an envelope with no return address. Notable internal marriages: Philip II, son of Charles V, married his own niece Anna of Austria. 2. They were uncle and niece, marrying to unite the Austrian and Spanish branches of the Habsburgs. Philip IV, father of Carlos II, married his own niece, Mariana of Austria. She was both his biological niece and his wife. At the same time, Margarita Teresa, sister of Carlos, the ill-smelling princess, was also married to her own uncle Leopold I. Confused yet? That's without mentioning kings who married their brother's widow, or married two sisters within less than 10 years. They didn't marry nations, they married their own bloodline. Light joke: the Habsburgs didn't need a 3-generation lineage for a birth certificate, because sometimes all 3 generations were the same person. Biological and mental consequences. If you studied high school biology, you may remember inbreeding increases the risk of children inheriting recessive genetic disorders, because both father and mother can carry the same faulty gene. And when faulty meets faulty, there is no healthy gene to fix it. The result: facial bone deformities such as the Habsburg jaw, severe protrusion of the lower jaw, neurological issues, intellectual delays, infertility or hormonal disorders, weak immune systems, prone to illness, and, as in the case of Carlos, total physical collapse from birth. Many generations of Habsburg kings could not escape it. Some died young. Some had no children. Some died the night of their wedding. And the most painful part, they knew. Court physicians repeatedly issued warnings. A few old records even stated clearly one should not marry a first-degree relative. But the court turned a deaf ear, because to them, love was dangerous, and power had to be born from blood that had already been screened. You can clearly see Carlos II was not an isolated case, but the natural conclusion of a failed breeding program. In modern society, people often warn against marriage between close relatives within 3 generations, but for the Habsburgs, 3 generations was just lunch. The only concern was who held the land, who held the crown, and the final result was no one kept anything at all. You're still here, aren't you? Still listening between the steady hum of the fan, the dim light, and the story's pace slowing like the rhythm of late-night breathing. But don't fall asleep yet, because the moment Carlos II closed his eyes, all of Europe opened theirs. People might think when a king dies without an heir, you simply hold a funeral and choose another. But no, for the Spanish throne at the start of the 18th century, it was a red button, a war switch, an invitation for empires to ready their armies. Because you know, when an empire collapses without a legitimate successor, the distant relatives, or even those merely claiming to be, swoop in like vultures to a body still warm. The final will, and a thunderclap in the great hall as Carlos lay dying. It was said that all Madrid seemed to hold its breath, not out of emotion, but because no one knew to whom he would leave the crown. When the will was read aloud in the great hall of the Alcazar, in the dim candlelight, the declaration tore through the air. My sole and legitimate heir is Philippe, Duke of Anjou, grandson of King Louis XIV of France. Oh, you feel the storm now. Don't you? Louis XIV, the most powerful son king of France, suddenly had a grandson on the Spanish throne. And so, 2 of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe risked merging, not through weapons, but through bloodline. Joke number 1. All of Europe at that moment cried out, "Hey!" Who said we were playing together the War of the Spanish Succession? When an entire continent dove into a bloody chess game, the French applauded. The Austrians slammed the table. England panicked. The Netherlands summoned generals. Immediately, the largest alliance in Europe at the time was formed, called the Grand Alliance. It included England, Austria, German branch of the Habsburgs, the Netherlands, several small states in Germany, Italy, and Portugal. Their goal was clear: to prevent the French Bourbons from swallowing all of Spain. And so, war began. From the year 1701 to 1714, nearly 15 years of bloodshed. Across the continent, from the Mediterranean Sea to the cold fields of Flanders, hundreds of thousands of soldiers dead, millions of civilians affected, and the balance of power in Europe constantly shifting. One throne, two claimants, three empires battered, while Louis XIV's grandson, Philippe of Anjou, sat on the Spanish throne. The Austrian Emperor Leopold I declared no, that throne belongs to the German Habsburg line, because Carlos's mother was Austrian. Therefore, I am the closer relative. So he put forward his nephew, Archduke Charles, as the legitimate king of Spain. And why did this war last so long? Because no one really wanted Spain. They wanted everything Spain held. The territories in Italy, Naples, Milan, Sardinia, the Iberian Peninsula, the vast colonies in the Americas and Asia, the treasure fleets from the New World won throne, but with it, the map of the world. Joke number 2. Carlos II lost one testicle, but Europe lost 14 years because of it. The Treaty of Utrecht. When Europe sat down with a sigh. Finally, after more than a decade of chaos, the sides had to sit down and sign the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. Main points: Philippe of Anjou kept the Spanish throne, but had to renounce his claim to the French crown. Austrian Habsburgs received the wealthy territories in Italy and the Netherlands. England, shrewdly and quietly, took Gibraltar and secured the right to trade slaves, something that later helped them dominate the seas. All of Europe breathed a sigh of relief, not because the war had ended, but because, at last, a will had been fully resolved. And after all, how is Carlos II remembered? No one calls him a hero. No one built a statue of him on horseback. No songs are sung of his victories, but in silence, in medical manuscripts, in the dusty genealogy charts of historians, Carlos is remembered as the most vivid warning of the consequences of unnatural decisions. Joke number 3. If Carlos had lived to see the consequences of a bloodline that was too pure, he might have asked for a DNA test much earlier. Are you resting your head on your pillow now? Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the ancient clock in the Escorial Palace just strikes its final chime. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty ends in silence. And then you hear the music change. Not the melancholy strum of Madrid's guitars, but the faint violins echoing from marble corridors gleaming under candlelight, where red and white velvet curtains embroidered with gold cascade from high ceilings to patterned stone floors. You are walking into the Palace of Versailles, the most luxurious in Europe, where the best-dressed people hide the loneliest souls. And in that setting, she appears, Marie Antoinette, the 14-year-old girl from Austria, born to be a diplomatic tool and to die as a traitor. A different bloodline, a different form of captivity. Marie Antoinette was the 15th of 16 children of Empress Margarita Teresa of Austria, from the German branch of the Habsburgs. You remember? Don't you? The same family as Carlos II, only on the other side of Europe. And true to family tradition, when there were many daughters, the question was never, whom do you want to marry, but which country needs an alliance. France and Austria had been bitter enemies. But then, the geopolitical chessboard shifted, and to seal the peace treaty, young Marie Antoinette was chosen as the marriage gift, sent to Versailles to marry the French Dauphin Louis, who would later become King Louis XVI. Imagine this. You are only 14. You've just finished your handwriting lessons, never had your first kiss, and you're dressed in a wedding gown to become the symbol of an alliance. The carriage rolls out of Schönbrunn Palace and never comes back. First light-hearted joke, Marie was living proof of the phrase marry and follow your husband, except your husband follows no one at all. The French court, where everyone smiles, but no one trusts anyone. If you think Versailles was a fairy tale place, think again. There, dresses were lifted by steel frames. Wigs stood almost as tall as a mirror, and the bows between nobles often came with a smile, like a knife hidden in velvet. Marie was not welcomed. She was called the foreigner, the empty-headed Austrian princess, the brainless royal doll. The French court, already cunning, was even harsher toward a young girl with no allies. The wedding night, or rather, the first 7 years of marriage, nothing happened. Louis, the young husband, was shy, awkward, and according to many accounts, did not know what to do with his wife. Yes, literally, Marie was embarrassed. The ladies in waiting were curious. The public began to invent stories. Joke number 2, Versailles, was the place where if you didn't have a scandal, they would make one for you. The non-existent cake and a reputation burned to ash. The older Marie grew, the more she tried to adapt. She hosted parties, dressed up, danced, kept dogs, drank chocolate, trying to find joy in a life without real love. And it was precisely this that made the people, drowning in famine and taxes, see her as a symbol of waste. You've heard the phrase, if they have no bread, let them eat cake. That was the line attributed to Marie Antoinette. But you know what? She never said it. No historical record shows she ever uttered those words. It was just one of hundreds of things fabricated to turn a woman into the excuse for public hatred. Historians still debate the extent to which Marie truly spent extravagantly. Some say she was merely a pawn. Others say she was genuinely careless. But what is undeniable is this. Whatever she did, no one looked at her kindly. And you know what comes next. Revolution. The chateau destroyed, the palace abandoned, the king captured, and Marie, from Queen of France, became prisoner number 280. Can you imagine someone who once stood on the royal balcony, waving to thousands of cheering people, and only a few years later, huddling in a small prison cell, where the only light entered through rusted iron bars? Marie Antoinette lived that. Her cell in the Conciergerie, a medieval fortress in the heart of Paris, was where important criminals were held before being sent to the guillotine. But for Marie, it was not just a cell. It was the waiting room for death. Cold walls, damp floors, the musty smell of lime mixed with the breath of guards, and absolute silence, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy silence of waiting. Every morning, Marie woke up with the same question in her mind. Is today my day? Joke number 1, bitter as it is, was Versailles once had 700 mirrors. But here, there wasn't even one to see herself one last time. The sham trial and the cruelest accusation. On October 14th, 1793, the trial of Marie Antoinette began. The Revolutionary Tribunal, never a place to seek justice, was a place to perform justice. Marie was charged with every imaginable crime, draining the national treasury, conspiring with foreign powers, acting against the people. But the heaviest charge was the accusation that she committed incest with her own son, Louis Charles, the 8-year-old boy. Upon hearing that charge, Marie, who had learned to remain silent for years, finally reacted. She stood, trembling, and looked directly at the jury. I am a mother, and I cannot respond to an accusation that even a mother's heart cannot hear without shuddering. The entire courtroom fell silent. Do you see sometimes a single sentence is enough to strip a trial of its pretense? But still, the verdict had been decided long before death by guillotine. The final morning, and the proud walk on October 16th, 1793, Paris was freezing, fog coating each cobblestone of the old streets. Marie was awakened early. They cut her hair short at the neck, so the guillotine would not catch. She wore a plain white chemise, simple and clean, not to show humility, but because it was all she had left. No entourage, no ceremony, no crown, only a rough wooden cart, a waiting crowd, and a 37-year-old woman, holding her head high as she walked through the jeers. And you know what? Along the entire road, Marie did not bow her head. She did not hide her face. She did not beg. Some say that when she stepped up to the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot and quietly said, "Pardon me, sire. I did not mean to." Joke number 2, though sad, is even in death. Marie kept her royal manners. One head falls, and a dynasty ends. The blade fell, swift and final. The square erupted in cheers. But a few wept, not because they supported Marie, but because they realized, at last a person, even a queen, could become the perfect sacrificial pawn for a bloodthirsty revolution. Historians still debate Marie's true role in the running of the court. Some claim she was irresponsible. Others say she was merely a facade, a lavish doll pushed to the front to take the blame for all. But one thing is certain, she was the last in a long line of royal women to die for a crown they never chose to wear. And if you're still awake now, ask yourself, if you were born in that era, would you survive? If you were married off at 14, isolated in a foreign land, unloved by your husband, hated by the people, how long could you endure? Marie Antoinette was not an angel, but she was not a devil either. She was a woman locked in the gilded cage of royalty, bound by the Habsburg name, just like Carlos II. But instead of dying from genetics, she died from prejudice. Do you remember? When Marie Antoinette bowed her head to apologize to the executioner for stepping on his foot, she showed the world that pride does not necessarily lie in power, but in the way we fall. And if you turn the clock back nearly 250 years before Marie, to a misty kingdom in the northwest of Europe, you will see another woman walking up to the scaffold, not for treason, not for extravagance, but for failing to give birth to a son. Anne Boleyn, the woman who made England leave the church. Her name was Anne Boleyn, an English gentlewoman, not a princess, not of royal blood, but with enough beauty, wit, and daring to unseat a Spanish queen from the throne and become the second wife of King Henry VIII. If you've ever heard of a man breaking up with a girlfriend just because they were incompatible, then imagine a man breaking up with the Pope to marry his mistress. Yes, a true story. Henry VIII declared his divorce from Queen Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, simply because she could not give him a son. The Pope refused, and Henry broke England away from the Catholic Church, creating the Anglican Church to marry Anne Boleyn. Joke number 1. Some men change wives. Some men change religion. Henry changed the state religion, from revered queen to cursed shadow. Anne was once the new hope. Young, charming, fluent in French, skilled at music, with her own sense of style, and able to debate with the king. In Henry's eyes, she was not just a lover, she was a revolution. Until she gave birth, a daughter, Elizabeth, later the great Queen Elizabeth I. But at that time, just a disappointment that could not cry away the king's frustration. Henry cooled. Anne suffered several miscarriages, and then coldness became the excuse for accusations. She was charged with adultery with 5 men, an affair with her own brother. Yes, you read that right, plotting to kill the king. The trial was swift. No one dared oppose it, and Anne, the woman who had turned all of Europe's gaze, was sentenced to death. Death, and last words calm as candlelight. On the day of execution, Anne wore a grey dress, hair neatly tied. No tears. She knelt, not on wood, but on a cushion of silk she had prepared herself. The executioner came from France, the best, because Anne did not want to be beheaded with an English axe. Do you see the heartbreak here? A woman executed for not producing a son, yet still concerned with the neatness of her own death. Her final words were, "I have not come here to complain, but to die." And when the sword fell, history fell with it, split between love and ambition, a bloodline left uncontinued, a head left unforgiven. The death of Anne Boleyn is one of the most famous executions in English history, not because she was evil, but because she was too real, too direct, and too unwilling to bow. Historians still debate whether she actually committed adultery. No clear evidence exists. Only coerced testimonies and a few nods, given out of fear of the king. Joke number 2. Anne's crime was not betrayal. It was making men feel small before an intelligent woman. And if you're still listening at this hour, then you've just travelled through 3 centuries of women who wore crowns, but never chose their own lives. Margarita Teresa, the princess who smelled because of her genes. Marie Antoinette, the queen no one trusted, simply because she was an outsider. Anne Boleyn, the wife who was beheaded for the crime of not being the mother of a prince. Do you remember Anne Boleyn? She lost her life because she could not give birth to a son. So if you were born a queen, gave birth to a male heir, possessed beauty that could topple kingdoms, beloved and praised across Europe, would you be happy? The answer is no. Not for Sisi, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, wife of Emperor Franz Joseph I, a woman who had everything except herself. From a country girl to empress in a single morning, Sisi was born in 1837, raised in Bavaria in a minor noble family, free, riding horses, writing poetry, climbing trees, laughing loudly. She never thought of the throne, much less dreamed of court life, until she was 15. Franz Joseph, the young emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was supposed to marry Sisi's older sister. But then, when he saw Sisi, he changed his mind. Immediately. In front of the entire court, in front of his own mother, Sisi became empress in less than 1 week from their first meeting. Does it sound like a fairy tale to you? But you'll see, this is a fairy tale written in black ink. Joke number 1. Franz Joseph's heart may have been stolen by Sisi, but the rest of her life was kept under lock and key by the royal family. Versailles was suffocating, but Vienna was worse. Right after the wedding, Sisi was swallowed by the Habsburg court machinery, elaborate rituals, maids-in-waiting watching her, a mother-in-law controlling every spoonful of soup, every move she made, how she ate, spoke, stood, breathed, was judged. Her first son, Crown Prince Rudolph, was taken from her at birth. Sisi was not allowed to raise him, not allowed to choose his name, not allowed to see him for more than a few hours a week. In her diary, she wrote, "I was born a butterfly, but they pinned me in a display case." Beauty and the illness of obsession. Sisi had an unusual beauty, a slender figure, hair down to her knees, eyes as grey as mountain mist. But you know what? That beauty became an invisible chain. She was obsessed with keeping her figure, even after 3 children. Sisi maintained a waist under 50 centimeters. Through an extreme diet and 6 hours of exercise a day, her hair was so long it required 3 attendants to wash, dry, and comb. But she hated mirrors, hated court gowns, hated being stared at. And slowly, she disappeared from the public eye. She left the palace, left the emperor, left the empire altogether, travelling endlessly across Europe with the excuse of poor health. But in truth, It was to escape. And then, the thing she could not escape, came in autumn 1998. Sisi was in Geneva, Switzerland, resting, with no bodyguards, no attendants. She was simply disguised, just like an older lady taking a stroll by the lake. An anarchist named Luigi Luceni happened to learn she was there. He didn't care who she was. He just wanted to kill any member of royalty as a message for the anarchist cause. He prepared a sharpened file, and when Sisi stepped out of the hotel to board her boat, he struck once, straight into her chest. She still walked a few meters, still boarded the boat, still smiled at her companion. Only when she collapsed did they discover her heart had been torn. Joke number 2. Bitter enough to choke. People spent a lifetime trying to pierce Sisi's heart. But Luigi only needed a file and a second. Farewell, Sisi, the Empress of the Winds. Sisi's funeral was not the funeral of an empress in the traditional sense. It was the funeral of a soul that had never been allowed to truly live. Emperor Franz Joseph wept. All of Europe mourned. But some said Sisi is dead. At last, she is free. Historians still debate whether Sisi suffered from severe depression or from an eating disorder. But one thing no one denies, she was the living symbol of a heart crushed by power. Pregiudice. And title, You've Just Left Cold Geneva, where Empress Sisi fell to a single stab after a lifetime spent running from a crown she never wished for. Now imagine you step into a damp stone cellar, low ceilings, flickering oil lamps, no wind, no singing, nothing at all, except the sound of ragged breathing and chains dragging on the floor. There, a royal family is waiting to die. Empress Alexandra of Russia, and the death in a basement without a prayer. Have you heard of the Romanovs, the dynasty that ruled Russia for 300 years? Princes riding horses over ice, palaces gilded white as snow, balls that lasted from dusk until dawn, and then it all ended in a small cellar in Yekaterinburg. No funeral, no farewell, no survivors. The Queen from England, the outsider in the frozen heart of Russia, Empress Alexandra, born Alex of Hesse, granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England, was an English-born German married into Russia. She was not used to the cold, not used to Russian ceremony, not fluent in Russian, and when she became the wife of Tsar Nicholas II, she was not loved by the Russian people. They called her the stranger on the throne. Light-hearted joke number 1. If there were a syndrome for the in-laws hate the bride, Alexandra had the international version. Love, and the faith in the mystical, but she loved Nicholas deeply, truly. In centuries of political marriages, Alexandra was one of the rare ones who genuinely loved her husband. And then they had children, 4 daughters, and finally, a son, Tsarevich Alexei. But joy turned to grief. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a genetic legacy from Queen Victoria's bloodline. Just a small bruise could kill him, and in desperation, Alexandra turned to a holy man, Rasputin. Rasputin, and the spiral of suspicion that drowned the throne. Rasputin, a wandering peasant, tangled hair, long beard, eyes like hypnosis. He was not a doctor, not a priest, but whenever he laid his hands on Tsarevich Alexei, the pain eased. Alexandra believed he was sent by God. The court feared him. The press mocked him. The people were furious. A foreign-born empress, carrying a genetic illness, befriending a charlatan, while the country was in war, famine, and chaos. That situation only needed a spark. Revolution and gunfire in the night. In 1917, the Russian Revolution broke out. Nicholas abdicated. The Romanov family was placed under house arrest, then moved to a safe house in the Ural region. They lived in harsh conditions, under strict guard, and had no idea They had already been sentenced to death. At dawn on July 17th, 1918, an execution squad entered the cellar where the family was sleeping. No trial, no verdict, only orders. A cellar, and the 20 most horrific minutes in European royal history. Nicholas was shot first. Then Alexandra, then the children. They tried to shield each other, begged for mercy, prayed. But the room was too small. The guns jammed. Blood splattered the walls. The daughters, wearing corsets sewn with diamonds to hide their wealth, caused the bullets to ricochet. The soldiers had to use bayonets. No one survived. No one was given a proper burial. The bodies were hastily buried in the forest, doused with acid, burned with gasoline, to erase all traces. Joke number 2. Grim. But proven by history, thrones don't have seatbelts. When the brakes fail, the whole family goes down at once. And in the end, who was Alexandra A. Queen, who tried to be a good wife? A mother who loved her son to obsession, a woman hated for being unlike anyone else, yet still writing to her husband every day like a lovesick girl. They blamed her for the revolution. But perhaps her only crime was believing in something that could not be saved. You've just heard the stories of those who once lived in gilded palaces, with hundreds of servants, who stood before thousands of adoring eyes, and then each of them, one by one, fell because of things unseen, faulty genes, prejudice, jealousy, and palaces without escape routes. Some died for status. Some died for love. Some died for believing in the most beautiful thing in the world and were broken because of it. You see, none of them were ever truly free. But you are different. You are not a queen. You are not married off for a treaty. You don't have to wear 7 layers of gowns while smiling at people deciding when you should die. You just need to close your eyes, breathe out softly, and leave all the sorrows of humanity behind. Your world is turning off its lights. And even if out there is war, thrones collapsing, dynasties consumed by fire, here in your small room at this moment, there is only the sound of steady breathing, the soft wind through the window, and a wish for a peaceful sleep. Wishing you a deep sleep. No nightmares. No chains. No crowns. Just yourself. Light as a cloud. Still as mist. Peaceful as a candle just blown out. Good night. See you in the next dream.